Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Western Tales. Tonight, I want to share a story about mercy, redemption, and how even the coldest winter can't freeze the warmth of the human heart. It's called The Blind Woman at Copper Creek. It was a winter night in the Wyoming Territory, 1886, the kind of cold that made iron groan and trees crack under their own weight. Inside a weathered log cabin tucked between snow-covered pines, a man named Elias Porter worked by the light of a single lantern. He was a saddle maker, hands thick with callus, eyes worn from years of grief and hard living. The sound of the needle through leather was steady, almost like a heartbeat, the only rhythm left in his quiet life. Outside, the wind clawed at the shutters, whistling through every crack it could find. Now and then, Elias lifted his head and listened, not for wolves, not for outlaws, but for the small, steady breaths coming from the loft above him. His children were asleep. Henry, 9 years old, dreamed of horses and open fields. June, only 6, clutched the patchwork doll her mother had sewn before she passed. When Elias looked up at that loft, he always felt two things at once: the pride of a father and the emptiness of a man who'd lost the woman who once filled this cabin with laughter. The fire had burned low, shadows dancing across the walls like ghosts that refused to leave. He was just threading another stitch when he heard it. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. He froze. In the wilderness, nobody came calling after midnight unless something was wrong. Bandits, drifters, desperate souls, he'd seen them all. He waited, thinking maybe it was the wind. Then came the sound again, weaker this time, as if whoever was out there had almost lost their strength. Elias stood up, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. He glanced toward the rifle leaning by the door, then stopped halfway. Something instinct maybe told him this wasn't danger. It was need. He unlatched the door, and a gust of snow burst inside, scattering ashes across the hearth. And there she was, a woman wrapped in rags, her face ghost pale against the storm. Snow clung to her eyelashes, her hair, her shawl. Her lips were cracked, her hands raw and bleeding. But what froze Elias more than the cold was her eyes milky white. Unseeing, blind, she opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. Then her knees buckled, and she collapsed right there on his doorstep. Without thinking, Elias caught her before she hit the floor. Her skin was ice, her pulse faint. He carried her to the fire and laid her down on a blanket, the same quilt his wife once used when their babies had fever. The stew pot still hung over the dying coals. He poured what was left into a bowl and spooned it to her lips, drop by drop, until a bit of color came back to her cheeks. When she finally whispered, it wasn't her name. It was just 2 words, "Thank you." Elias said nothing. Words felt too small for what he saw. He gave her his chair by the fire, stoked the flames higher, and draped his own coat over her shoulders. The woman tried to protest out of pride. Maybe, but her body trembled too hard to finish a sentence. He only said, "Rest now. You're safe here." Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal. But inside, the cabin began to breathe. Again the soft crackle of fire, the slow rhythm of her breathing, and the sound of Elias moving quietly, as if afraid to wake something sacred. Hours passed. She slept. Elias sat across from her, elbows on his knees, watching the flames flicker across her face. He noticed the scars on her hands, long-healed burns. Old cuts, the kind that came from years of hard work and harder living. Whoever she was, she'd carried a long road on her back before it ended at his door. Up in the loft, June stirred in her sleep and murmured something, a small sound, soft as a prayer. For the first time in years, Elias realized the silence in his home didn't hurt quite as much. He leaned back in his chair, eyes heavy, the warmth of the fire washing over him. The storm outside kept raging, but inside, something had changed. In that fragile, flickering light, Elias Porter, a widower, a father, a man long emptied by loss, felt the faint stir of something he hadn't known in a long time. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't sorrow. It was hope. Morning crept slowly over Copper Creek, a thin, silver light spilling through frost-bitten windows. The storm had passed, but the world outside lay buried beneath a sea of white. Elias Porter woke in his chair, his neck stiff and his fire gone to embers. For a moment, he wondered if he'd dreamed it all, the knocking, the woman, the weight of her frozen body in his arms. But then he heard it, the faint sound of movement by the hearth. She was awake. The woman sat near the fire, wrapped in his wife's quilt, her fingers tracing the edge of the fabric like she was reading it. Her hair, once matted with snow, now framed her face in soft, uneven strands of chestnut brown. Elias cleared his throat. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "You came to my door last night, near froze to death." The woman turned her head toward his voice, eyes unseeing but steady. "I remember the wind," she whispered, her voice thin but careful, like each word had to find its footing before it left her lips. "And your fire? What's your name?" "Clara," she said after a pause. "Clara Wynne." Elias nodded, though she couldn't see it. "You're welcome to stay till the snow lets up. Might be a few days yet. I don't take charity," Clara said, her chin lifting just a little. There was pride there, the kind that doesn't vanish even when a person's lost almost everything. "I can work, if you'll let me." Elias studied her for a moment. She was small, maybe 30, maybe more, hard to tell. Life on the frontier aged folks faster than years could. He said, "You rest first. Work can wait." But she didn't. Before noon, she'd found her way to the mending basket by touch, alone fingertips gliding across shirts and trousers, until she found one torn clean through the sleeve. From the pouch tied at her belt, she pulled a needle and thread. Elias watched in silence. Her hands moved steady and sure. Every stitch, neat, tight, perfect, faster than he could have managed, with both eyes wide open. Henry crept closer, eyes wide. "How do you do that?" he asked. Clara smiled faintly, the first sign of warmth he'd seen from her. "I look with my hands," she said, "and my ears, and my memory. You'd be surprised what a person can see when they have to." June giggled softly and leaned on her brother's shoulder. Elias couldn't help but notice the way the air in the cabin felt lighter, like some of the storm had been pushed back outside where it belonged. When noon came, Elias warmed what was left of the stew. Clara insisted on serving the children first. She counted the bowls by touch, filled each one, and somehow didn't spill a drop. As they ate, Henry asked where she'd come from. Clara hesitated. "South," she said finally. "A long way south." "Family there?" Elias asked, her lips pressed together. "Not anymore." The tone in her voice told him all he needed to know. Whatever she'd left behind was gone, burned up, buried, or both. They ate the rest of their meal in quiet. Outside, the snow melted from the roof in small rivulets that whispered against the eaves. That evening, after supper, Elias sat sharpening a blade by the fire while Clara taught June how to braid twine by feel. Henry read from his primer, stumbling over words but proud of every one he got right. When the boy finished, Clara said, "You read strong, Henry. Your ma teach you." He lowered his head. "She died. I'm sorry," Clara whispered. And those two words carried such weight that even the fire seemed to hush for a moment. Elias looked up from his work and saw her turn her face toward the flames, tears glinting on her cheeks, though she made no sound. Later, when the children had climbed the ladder to their beds, the cabin settled into silence again. The kind of silence that comes after pain has spoken all it can. Elias lingered at the table, pretending to check the stitching on a saddle strap, but really just listening. He heard her footsteps light, careful crossing the floor. Then, a soft click. He looked up. Clara had taken a small candle from her pouch. It was worn down to half its size, the wax rough from travel. She lit it with a trembling match and set it before her on the table. The flame flickered weakly, throwing gold light across her face. She bowed her head and whispered something so faint he almost thought it was the wind again. A single name, maybe, or a prayer for the dead. Elias didn't ask. Out here, a person's pain was their own, same as their faith. He only sat there in the half-dark, listening to the whisper of her voice fade into the crackle of the fire. When she blew the candle out, the room fell back into quiet, not the empty quiet of before, but something gentler. For the first time in 2 long winters, Elias Porter felt that his cabin was more than just a shelter against the cold. It was alive again. By the end of that week, the snow around Copper Creek began to melt into slow, brown rivers that cut through the mud. The world was waking up again, and with it came the noise not from wind or wolves this time, but from people. You see, Copper Creek was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and what they didn't know, they made up before supper. A widow could sneeze on Main Street, and half the county would be talking about her cold before sundown. So when word spread that Elias Porter had taken in a blind woman, the talk started faster than spring thaw. Some said she was an escaped convict. Others whispered she'd been a saloon girl run out of Cheyenne. And a few said she was a ghost, walking the earth for her sins. Elias paid no mind, at least at first. He had more important things to do. The days were longer now. The light warmer. He split logs, patched the roof, and taught Henry how to oil the saddle seams. And inside that cabin, life found its rhythm again, steady and calm. Clara Wynne, true to her word, worked like she'd been born to it. She baked, mended, taught the children songs from her childhood. She never complained, never rested long. But what struck Elias most was the sound of her voice when she read. One afternoon, she asked Henry to bring her the old Bible that sat on the shelf, still coated in dust from 2 winters of neglect. Elias hesitated when she asked for it. That book was his wife's. He hadn't opened it since she'd died. Still, he fetched it down. The pages were thin and brittle, the edges yellowed by time. Clara ran her fingertips over the cover, feeling the letters carved deep into the leather. Then she turned to Henry and said, "Would you like to learn from this?" The boy's eyes widened. "Pa says reading's not for the likes of us." Clara smiled softly. "Then maybe your pa was wrong." That evening, As the light faded, Henry sat beside her, repeating each verse she read, slow and clumsy at first. Then stronger, steadier. Elias pretended to work at his bench, but his hands had stopped moving long ago. He listened from the corner, his heart tight. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Her voice was low, rich, and sure like the wind through the valley. He mouthed the words silently, remembering his wife's voice. That same verse on the night she passed. But now, instead of pain, something gentler took its place. The next morning, Elias rode into town for supplies. Copper Creek looked smaller than he remembered. A single dusty street lined with wooden storefronts. A blacksmith. A general store. A bank that always seemed to frown at the rest of the town. Outside that bank stood Judge Hal Winton, tall as a fence post. Wrapped in a fur collar that didn't quite hide his scowl, he called out, "Porter." Elias stopped, keeping his tone even. "Judge." Winton studied him for a long moment. "Heard you've got company up there at your cabin." Elias didn't answer. The judge shifted his weight, his boots crunching the thawed gravel. "You and me both know good men don't keep strays under their roof." Elias looked him dead in the eye. "Good men," he said, "don't turn folks out to die in the snow for a heartbeat." Neither man moved. Then Winton's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You've got children, Porter. Think about them before you let that woman ruin you." Elias tipped his hat and walked away, the sound of his boots fading into the wind. That night, when he came home, Clara was sitting by the hearth, teaching Henry again. June sat curled up beside her, tracing letters in the air with her finger. "Pa," Henry said proudly, "I can read a whole verse now." Elias nodded, his throat too tight for words. He hung his coat, sat quietly, and let the sound of their voices fill the room. It had been years since his home had felt like this, alive, warm, human. But as spring crept closer, so did the whispers. At the general store, men stopped talking when Elias walked in. At church, women shifted away from his children in the pew. Even his old friend Jed Murphy wouldn't meet his eyes. One evening, he found a note nailed to his gatepost. No name, just 6 words burned into the wood with a hot poker. "She ain't your burden to keep." He pulled it down without a word and tossed it into the fire. The children never saw it. Clara never asked. But from that night on, he caught her praying longer, her candle burning lower. Sometimes, he'd wake in the dark and hear her whispering names he didn't know. Sometimes, he wondered if she prayed for herself or for him. Still, when dawn came, she rose before anyone else. The smell of coffee filled the cabin, and the fire burned bright again. And though the town might have been turning colder, Elias Porter's home for the first time in years was growing warm. The days lengthened, and the thaw crept down from the mountains like a slow forgiveness. Streams began to move again, whispering under the snowmelt. The smell of wet pine drifted through the valley. Inside the Porter cabin, life had fallen into a gentle rhythm, one that no one dared speak of for fear of breaking it. Elias worked the leather. Henry split kindling. June sang softly while Clara kneaded dough by feel. But that night, something shifted. The air had that kind of stillness that comes before confession. After supper, Elias sat by the hearth, mending a strap, pretending not to watch Clara as she tidied the table. She paused, her fingers brushing the old Bible that sat near the firelight. "Mr. Porter," she said quietly, Your boy told me this book belonged to your wife. Elias nodded, his throat dry. Sarah, he said. She read from it every night. Even on the night she passed. Clara's blind eyes turned toward the sound of his voice. Would you like me to read it? For a moment. He said nothing. That Bible had sat closed for 2 winters. Heavy with all he couldn't face. The thought of hearing those words again, her words cut deep. But then, something inside him gave way. He nodded. Clara opened the book, found the page by touch, and began. Her voice was soft at first, uncertain, but soon it steadied, low and warm, filling the small cabin with a peace that felt older than grief itself. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. The words rolled through the air like a river through stone, smoothing everything they touched. Elias bowed his head, his rough hands trembling. He tried to read those same verses to his dying wife and failed. Now, hearing them again in Clara's voice was like opening a wound that had finally started to heal. June and Henry sat near the fire, wide-eyed, listening. The flame flickered, painting their faces gold. When Clara finished, silence held the room. Only the crackle of wood and the steady rhythm of her breathing filled the air. Thank you, Elias whispered. Clara smiled faintly. The good books meant to be heard, not hidden. That night, long after the children had gone to sleep, Elias found himself still at the table, staring at the Bible. He reached out, touched the page. The letters felt foreign shapes of a world he'd never entered. He dusted a handful of flour across the tabletop and, using the blunt end of a spoon, traced the first letter he saw, B, then another, I. The lines weren't straight, the curves clumsy, but they were his. Clara stirred in her chair. You're trying, she said softly. Elias looked up, surprised. How'd you know? I can hear it, she said. When someone wants to learn, it sounds different in the room. He chuckled under his breath. A man my age. Learnin' letters by lamplight. There's no age for learning, Clara said. Only for giving up. She rose slowly, found her way to the table, and placed her hands beside his. Here, she murmured. Like this. Together they traced the letters slow, careful, patient. Her touch guided his hand, her voice guiding his thoughts. Outside, the wind sighed through the eaves. Inside, it felt like spring had finally found its way indoors. When he managed to spell the first word, God, he froze, hardly daring to breathe. Clara squeezed his hand. See, you already know the hardest one. Elias smiled, though his eyes burned. Never thought I'd say this, he murmured. But I reckon you're a fine teacher. And you, she said, are a good man. He turned away, swallowing the lump in his throat. Don't know about that, but Clara only smiled. That quiet, knowing kind of smile that made a man wish he deserved it. Hours passed like minutes. The lamplight burned low. The children breathed softly in their beds. And still they traced words in the flower mercy. Grace. Home. Outside. The world slept. Except for one man, beyond the fence line, half hidden in the brush. A rider sat motionless. Clay Dobbs, Judge Winton's hired hand, chewed a splinter of wood between his teeth and watched the light flicker through the cabin window. He'd been sent to see what kind of woman Elias Porter was harboring. What he saw instead was a sight that didn't fit any story the town liked to tell. a blind woman teaching a widower to read, children laughing soft in their sleep, and the sound of scripture drifting through the dark like a hymn. Clay shifted in his saddle. Uneasy, he spat into the snow, muttering, "Ain't no harm in that." But still he turned his horse toward town. By dawn, every porch in Copper Creek would know that Elias Porter's cabin held not just a stranger, but something far more dangerous to small minds. A home. Sunday came bright and cold. The kind of morning when the sky feels too clean, too empty to hide a lie. Elias Porter rose before the sun, shaved with the dull edge of his razor, and set out his best coat, the one he hadn't worn since Sarah's funeral. He told himself it was just another Sabbath. But his hands trembled as he buttoned the collar. Clara dressed quietly, finding her shawl by touch. When the children asked if she'd come with them, she hesitated only a moment before saying yes. She said the Lord's house was for everyone. Elias knew that was true in heaven, less certain about Copper Creek. They hitched the wagon and rode into town through a pale light that broke across the snow like shattered glass. As they neared the white clapboard church, Elias felt the eyes already waiting. Every wagon, every pair of gloves, every hat brim turned their way. When he helped Clara down, the murmurs started, low at first, then spreading like brush fire through dry grass. "She's blind," someone whispered. "Living with him," another added. Elias heard it all, every word sharp as sleet. He didn't look up. He only offered Clara his arm and said, "Step easy," inside. The air smelled of pine boards and cold perfume. The congregation shifted in the pews as the Porter family walked down the aisle farther. 2 children, and the stranger they'd taken in. Even the organ seemed to lose its voice for a moment. The preacher, young Reverend Hewitt, swallowed hard and fumbled through his notes. Elias chose a bench halfway back, the same place he'd sat with Sarah years before. Clara bowed her head, hands folded, her blind eyes steady toward the pulpit. June climbed close beside her. Henry pressed in on the other side like a guard. The sermon began. But the preacher's voice wavered. He spoke of charity, forgiveness, brotherly love, yet his eyes kept sliding toward Judge Winton in the front row. And whatever courage the good book gave him, it wasn't quite enough. When he said, "Let him without sin cast the first stone," the irony hung heavy in the air. No one laughed, no one amened. Only the wind outside dared to answer through the rattling window panes. Elias stared straight ahead, jaw tight. He'd come to pray, not to fight. But every whisper behind him was a slap across the back of his neck. Still, he held his head high. Next to him, Clara's lips moved in silent prayer. He didn't know what she asked for: mercy, strength, or simply peace. But whatever it was, the sound of her whisper settled him. When the service ended, folks stood and filed out fast. No handshakes, no smiles, no fine weather today. Children were pulled close to mother's skirts. The only greeting came from Martha Doyle, who nodded once, eyes kind but cautious. Everyone else turned away. Outside, Judge Winton stood by the steps, gloves in one hand, pride in the other. He tipped his hat without warmth. "Fine sermon," he said, loud enough for half the town to hear. Elias met his gaze but didn't answer. Clara turned toward the voice, then quietly said, "Good morning, Judge." Her calm seemed to anger him more than defiance ever could. Elias guided her down the steps, his children walking close Heads bowed. The crowd parted not out of respect, but fear that decency might be catching. He felt every stare burning through his coat as they passed. The ride home was silent. The wheels creaked. The horses snorted, and the sound of distant bells faded behind them. Halfway up the ridge, Clara finally spoke. "I shouldn't have gone," she said softly. "I didn't mean to shame you before your neighbors." Elias kept his eyes on the road. "You didn't shame me." She smiled faintly. "You're kind, but we both know what they'll say." He shook his head. "Let them. They've been talking since the day I buried Sarah. They'll keep talking long after I'm gone." Clara turned her face toward the cold sunlight, letting it warm her cheeks. Still, a man's name is all he has in a place like this. Elias thought for a long time before answering. "A name's just wind if there's no soul behind it. You've given this house back its soul." When they reached the cabin, the fire had gone out, but the room still held the faint scent of fresh bread. Clara knelt by the hearth, feeling for kindling. Her hands were steady, her back straight, but her voice was quiet when she said, "Maybe I should leave. Elias, before I ruin what's left of your standing, before the town decides your kindness is sin." Elias crouched beside her, his rough hand covering hers. "Listen," he said, his voice low. "Certain. You've given this house back its light. You taught my boy to read, my girl to laugh again. Let them whisper. Let 'em freeze in their own cold hearts. I've lived alone with ghosts long enough." Clara didn't answer right away. She only nodded, the firelight glinting against her sightless eyes. Then, with a breath that sounded half like a sob and half like relief, she said, "All right, outside." The night closed in around the cabin. Inside, the flames caught, bright and steady, and for every cruel word spoken in town that day, the warmth in that little home burned 1 degree stronger, proof that love, once lit, doesn't yield to rumor or frost. The snow had long melted from the fields when the letter came folded neat, signed by a hand that pressed too hard into the paper. Judge Hal Winton was calling a town meeting. Elias Porter read the notice twice, though the words never changed. For the sake of public decency, that was the line that made his stomach turn. Everyone in Copper Creek knew what it meant. By sundown, the whole town gathered at the meeting hall. Farmers, merchants, wives wrapped in shawls. The same faces that had once brought casseroles when Sarah died. Now they came for something else, spectacle dressed up as righteousness. Elias stood near the front, yaw set, hat in hand. Beside him, Clara Wynne stood straight as a rail, her hands folded, her blind eyes still. You could see the tremor in her fingers, but her chin never dropped. When the crowd settled, Winton stepped up to the podium like a man walking to his own pulpit. He cleared his throat, eyes sweeping the room. "Neighbors," he began, "we've all heard talk, and we can't pretend any longer. Mr. Porter here," he gestured toward Elias, "has taken a woman into his home. Alone. No kin. No preacher's blessing. No law to speak of." A low murmur rolled through the hall. Winton let it build before raising a hand. "Now, I'm not here to pass judgment," he said, which was a lie everyone recognized. "But Copper Creek has a name to protect. Our children grow up watching us. We must show them what decency looks like." Someone called out, "She's blind, ain't she?" "Yes," Winton said smoothly. "All the more reason she belongs under proper care, not living with a widower." We all know how tongues wag. Elias took a step forward. Then maybe you ought to keep yours still. A few men chuckled nervously. But most looked away. Winton's smile thinned. You call this charity? Porter, or something else. Elias's voice cut through the murmurs. She's blind, not broken. And she's worked harder than any 10 men I know. Fed my children. Fixed what I couldn't fix. You talk about decency, that's it. Right there, Clara touched his arm. Quieting him. Her voice, when it came, was calm and clear. I asked for nothing. She said, I earn my keep. If kindness is a crime, then I suppose I'm guilty. For a moment, the hall went still. Then from the back came a voice. Elias recognized Jed Murphy. His oldest friend. The man who'd helped bury Sarah. Elias. Jed said softly. Maybe Winton's right. You've got children to think of. The town's turning ugly. Send her away before it ruins you. Elias turned to him. Disbelief and hurt crossing his face in the same heartbeat. Jed, he said, voice breaking. You know what it's like to lose everything. You gonna tell me to do it again? Jed's eyes dropped. I'm saying this as a friend, but the word friend felt hollow. Elias looked around the room, faces he'd known his whole life. Eyes that used to greet him with warmth, now shining with judgment or fear. He realized then that Copper Creek had never been half as kind as he'd imagined. Clara's hand slipped from his sleeve. It's all right, she said quietly. Elias shook his head. No, it is, she insisted. Her voice was steady, but her shoulders trembled. You've got your children to think of, and they need a future here. I won't be the reason they lose it. Winton folded his arms, satisfied. See there, the lady understands. Elias glared at him. You don't understand a damn thing. But the fight had gone out of the room. The whispers grew again, rolling like cold wind through the crowd, words too soft to catch, but sharp enough to wound. Clara turned toward the sound, her blind eyes somehow seeing more truth than any of them. May God judge you kinder than you've judged me, she said. With that, she stepped back, her face pale but peaceful. Goodbye, Elias, she whispered. Before he could stop her, she slipped through the crowd, counting her steps as she went, one careful movement at a time until the door closed behind her. The silence that followed was heavier than any sermon. Winton cleared his throat. Well, that's settled. Then, Elias didn't answer. He set his hat on his head, turned toward the door, and said only, You'll answer for this one day. Then he walked out into the night. The cold hit him like a slap. By the time he reached the cabin, the fire had gone out. Her shawl was gone. Her pouch of thread, her candle. Only the faint scent of her soap lingered in the air. He stood there, listening to the wind scrape across the eaves. And for the first time in years, the house felt emptier than the graveyard hill. Before dawn, he saw her track small prints heading north toward the ridgeline. He followed them a few yards before they vanished under drifting snow. Elias fell to his knees, his breath clouding the air, and whispered her name into the wind. It disappeared like a prayer swallowed by the cold. The days that followed were the longest Elias Porter had ever known. Without Clara, the house fell silent in a way no wind or winter storm could match. The children tried to pretend things were normal. June still sang to her doll. Henry still chopped kindling. But the laughter was gone, replaced by the sound of an old clock ticking too loud against the wall. Everywhere Elias looked, he saw traces of her, the mended shirts hanging by the door, the smooth wooden spoon she'd carved, the candle stub left beside her chair. At night, when he rose to stoke the fire, he could almost hear her voice reading softly in the dark. Henry asked one evening, "Pa, when's Miss Clara coming home?" Elias couldn't answer. June, smaller and braver, whispered, "She left because the town was mean. Maybe if we say sorry, she'll hear us." Elias only turned away. His throat burned too much for words. By the 7th morning, he couldn't stand it anymore. He saddled the mare, packed a blanket, a flask of water, and what bread was left. Before he mounted, Henry grabbed his arm. "You're bringing her back, aren't you?" the boy asked. Elias nodded once. "If she's still breathin'." Then he rode north, into the frozen hills. The land beyond Copper Creek was rough country pine forests, tangled in ice, ridges that caught the wind like knives. The trails were half buried, the sky heavy with new snow. Still, he rode. He called her name until his voice cracked. Sometimes, the wind seemed to answer back a sound that wasn't quite echo, not quite memory. He followed faint signs, a torn scrap of shawl caught on a branch, a trail of thread snagged on bark, footprints already softening under the storm's return. Each night, he camped under the open sky, praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. He prayed not for forgiveness, but for one more chance. By the second evening, the wind shifted east, bringing the smell of smoke faint but real. He spurred the horse forward. There, in a clearing between two ridges, stood a small trapper's hut, half collapsed and blackened by time. From the chimney rose a thin thread of smoke, wavering like a dying breath. Elias dismounted, heart hammering. He pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with cold and sickness. On the floor, wrapped in her shawl, lay Clara Wynne, pale as the snow outside. Her lips cracked, her skin burning with fever. Her hands clutched her candle stub, though the flame had long since died. When Elias knelt beside her, she stirred faintly. "Elias," she whispered, barely more than air. "I'm here," he said, lifting her into his arms. "You hear me? I've got you now." Her head rested against his chest. "You shouldn't have come. Don't you quit on me now?" he said, voice breaking. "You walked into my life in a storm. I ain't letting one take you back." He wrapped her tight in the blanket, mounted up, and turned the horse toward town. The snow began to fall again, thick and relentless. Hours blurred into miles. The cold bit deep. His hands went numb on the reins. But he never loosened his grip. Every few minutes he whispered her name, just to keep her tethered to the world. When at last the lights of Copper Creek appeared through the white haze, Elias was half frozen, his coat stiff with ice. But in his arms, Clara still breathed shallow, but steady. The townsfolk were gathering in the square, drawn by the sound of the horse pounding through the snow. Winton stepped out from the bank, disbelief written clear on his face. Elias reined in, his voice raw but strong. "She's sick," he said, "because I let you people shame her out of my home." No one moved. Only the church bell in the distance answered. He swung down from the saddle, cradling her against him like a child. The crowd parted without a word. "She's my family," Elias said, his voice carrying across the square. "And I'll stand before God on that." Winton's jaw tightened. "You'll lose everything." Elias looked around at the faces, the windows, the town that had once been his world. Then maybe I never had much worth keepin', he said. Martha Doyle, the old widow from the edge of town, pushed through the crowd. Bring her to my house, she said firmly. We'll see to her. Elias nodded, too tired to speak. As he carried Clara past the gawkers, he heard a single voice break the silence. Reverend Hewitt, the young preacher who'd faltered weeks before. He stepped forward, eyes wet. We call ourselves Christians, he said, but we left a woman to die in the snow. God forgive us. Others looked away, ashamed. Some followed him to Martha's porch. Others went home and locked their doors. Elias didn't care either way. He sat beside Clara's bed for 3 days and nights, never leaving her side, whispering the same words again and again. Don't quit. Not yet. Not when we just found each other. On the third morning, she stirred. Her lips moved. You came back. He caught her hand, pressing it to his cheek. I never should have let you go. Her fingers brushed his face. There's nothing to forgive, and for the first time in years, Elias Porter, the saddle maker of Copper Creek, the widower who had lived half a life in silence, bowed his head and wept. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft as absolution. Weeks passed, and winter loosened its grip on Copper Creek. The snow melted down the hillsides, feeding the creeks until they ran clear and full again. In the valley, the first blades of green pushed through the earth, small, stubborn, alive. Clara Wynne recovered slowly, but surely. Each morning she rose a little stronger, her steps a little surer. The fever had taken her strength, but not her spirit. She hummed while she worked, a soft tune that carried through the cabin like sunlight. Finding old wood, the town changed too. Judge Winton no longer met Elias's eyes when they crossed paths on the street. Martha Doyle stopped by with herbs and seeds. Neighbors who once turned away now left tools at the gate. A quiet peace offering that said what words could not. Elias plowed the garden. Henry followed behind, scattering seed. And little June tucked the last rows of sprouts into the soil with her bare hands. When he looked at them, Elias felt something rise in him, a peace that no sermon had ever given. That evening, the hills around Copper Creek bloomed purple and gold with wildflowers. Clara stood at the cabin door, her hands dusted with flour from the bread she'd baked. Inside, the smell of yeast and coffee filled the air. Elias sat by the table, reading aloud from the same Bible she once read to him. His voice was slow, steady, no longer the sound of a man who'd forgotten hope, but of one who had learned it letter by letter. Outside, the children's laughter echoed through the dusk. The sun dipped low over the valley, spilling gold across the mountains. Elias looked out the window and said quietly, "The whole sky looks like it's on fire." Clara turned toward his voice, smiling. "Then we made it, didn't we?" He reached for her hand and held it. "We did." And there, in the fading light of a hard country, two broken souls found what the world had once denied them: a home, a family, and the grace of second chances. In a land that knew more cold than kindness, one act of mercy thawed a man's heart and gave a blind woman back her home. If this story touched you, my friends, share your thoughts below. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Western Tales for more stories of love, redemption, and the quiet courage of the American frontier.